Hey guys, thank you for joining us. I am Stath Vaille, FC for Brave Collective. Here in comms today, I think we've got a lot of Brave guys, but hopefully we've got a few guys from other legacy alliances as well, so welcome. Please feel free to ask me questions as we start. I am talking about dictors today. Dictors are super duper fun. Dictors are one of my favourite ships to fly in EVE. I really enjoy them, and they are super powerful for getting us kills. So, as you probably are all aware, we live in nullsec. Nullsec allows bubbles, which is the reason that it is the only sensible place to PvP in EVE. Bubbles are super important because they allow you to hold an enemy fleet down. So in EVE, in almost all PvP, it may start out consensual, but at some point that PvP is going to become non-consensual. And what I mean by that is, one side's going to start losing and they're going to want to run away. Bubbles are the best way of stopping that from happening. So bubbles are the best way of forcing an enemy to fight you that doesn't want to otherwise. And they turn a fight where you get maybe 2 or 3 kills into a fight where you just dunk the entire fleet. So you as a dictor pilot can be super valuable and instrumental in turning the tides of a battle. To do that though, you've got to fly the dictor and you've got to know a little bit about fleet fights, how they work, your strengths, your weaknesses, and when you're the most useful. And that's what I'm hopefully going to talk about today. So, there are kind of 3 classes of dictor. I'm going to link in fleet now. So these are the 3 types of dictors you'd use for different situations. You can use any of them in any situation, but they're kind of specialised to certain parts. So people normally talk about sabres as dictors, maybe use the term interchangeably. Flycatcher, absolutely a legitimate choice. If you can fly a flycatcher and not a sabre, absolutely bring a flycatcher. Flycatcher sabre are shield chips, which is with a shield line, so you will get reps. That being said, you're not going to rely on reps as a dictor. Reps are not really what's going to keep you alive. Your mobility is going to keep you alive. You're going to be not where the enemy is able to shoot at you. For that reason, the sabre is probably ideal because it's a little faster than the flycatcher. Flycatcher is a little tankier, sabre's a little faster. Speed is your friend. That also means, because you're not really relying on reps, you could, theoretically, fly any of the armour dictors. They would work. People might look at you a bit weird, but you're not going to get reps anyway. So ideally, sabre's the best, flycatcher second, but any of the 4 dictors would absolutely work. Okay, so if you look at these, I've just linked in fleet, these fits. Let's look at the agony one first. So this is what I would call a small gang dictor. This is if there's like 20 of you or less, and you're on a roam. This gives you Interdiction Sphere Launcher, which is the module that allows you to drop your bubble. That's obviously quite important to a dictor. You've got a nanofiber, allows you to go faster, and you've got guns and scrams. Now this is where this fit differs from the other 2. This allows you to do 275 DPS with a 8k tank. So you're pretty light, you're pretty paper thin on this, but you can kill some dudes. It's good if you're super small gang and you need the extra DPS. The kind of shit we fly around Amencia, you probably never need this ship. You're better with just a straight up dictor because you want the deeps. Second one I linked is the Cynos sabre. Now this is one that's really come into vogue over late because most of what we do in Amencia is Rorke saves or kind of dropping big fleets on other fleets with cap support. So having the ability to get a dictor in front of an enemy, bubble up, then light a Cyno. So you trap the enemy fleet, you light the Cyno, and allows you to bring in either a Harpy fleet from a Titan bridge or caps and faxes from wherever they're staging up. So this is basically the same thing as the previous fit. Still pretty paper thin, you've only got 10k tank, but you've got a Cyno on this, which is obviously a huge advantage in niche scenarios. If you've got an ult in Amencia, just sat around not doing much, and you can fly one of these, super useful. Also, you see a Rorke's about to get tackled, if you can start burning one of these in the direction of that Rorke, let the FC know you've got it out in field, that can really turn the tides of battle. And the final one, the Fleet Sabre, this is a sabre I fly most of the time. This is designed to have maximum tank, it's got a cloak on it, and it's got a sphere launcher. And both of those modules are incredibly useful. Sphere launcher, for obvious reasons, so you can interdiction pro people, but the cloaking device as well, because like I said earlier, you're not surviving by having reps land on you, you're surviving by not getting shot by the enemy. There are 2 important characteristics of this ship which are good to know. Number 1's a cloak. Number 2 is this doesn't have a single offensive module on it. What that means is you will never get on a kill mail in this fleet unless someone tries to warp off when they're in your bubble and then dies. What that also means, though, you'll never have an aggression timer. So you can always jump a gate when you light the bubble. Lighting a bubble doesn't give you an aggression timer. So you can jump a gate when you light a bubble. Now, the best thing you can do in a dictor is get ahead of an enemy fleet when they're trying to run away from you, drop bubbles on them so they have to burn through them, it slows them down, and just kind of keep what we call waterboarding them, just keep bubbling them, slowing that fleet down until the friendly fleet that's chasing lands on top of them. And you can do this without any aggression, which is kind of cool, because even if you catch them once and our fleet jumps behind them, gets a few kills, they're probably going to turn their micro warp drives on, burn out, and some of them are going to get away. But because you never aggressed, you can continue to go ahead of them. The main fleet waits at 60 seconds for its aggression to go down, and then chases back on. So you getting ahead of people and not aggressing, super useful. Second reason not aggressing is good, is you can actually hold a reasonably sized fleet down by yourself if they're on a gate. So you jump into a system, you bubble up, you can wait your 30 seconds for your gate cloak to deactivate, you can then overheat prop mod, re-approach gate, jump through, wait 30 seconds on the other side, and at that point some of your shield will have recharged, and you can kind of keep doing this back and forth, bubbling on each side. And any fleet that's trying to kill you may just sit there and think they can get you, and eventually you will die, but that can be a real long time to get in and bubble people and get kills from the main fleet. So they're the three main fits that we talk about. Next I want to talk a little bit about bubble mechanics. So the bubble mechanics, there's obviously lots of different types of bubbles in EVE. You've got your anchored bubbles, you've got your bubbles from super capitals, you have hictors, and you have dictors. So what this class is focusing on is dictors, but I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between a hictor and a dictor and when they're useful. Both are incredibly useful, both have their purpose. Hictors are really good when you're supported by Logi. They've got a bit more tank, Logi wrap them up, you're bubbling shit up. It's really good for defensive bubbling, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, and they're really good if you want to tackle carriers or any kind of capital, because you've got a lot of tank, they don't immediately pop, and you can hold the infinity point down on them. They have quite a large sphere that emanates around them, and then as they fly, that sphere moves around. Dictors, on the other hand, drop interdiction probes, interdiction modules, ammo that they fire out of their probe launcher. So when you fit a probe launcher, you get 3 of these probes. You can pop a bubble, and you can pop them pretty quick, so you can pop 3 bubbles. They pop exactly where your ship is, and they will last in space for 2 minutes. They have a 20-kilometer range, so anything within that bubble for 2 minutes won't be able to warp out. 3 in your tube, and then you've got to reload. Reloading can be quite slow, but in recent changes you can now reload as you're going through gates.
Check FC, we have a spike in FYI. We might have some opportunity to test that out.
Okay, let me know if anything big gets tackled. I'd rather carry on this class until we're needed. But thank you.
Understood.
Okay, bubbles drop, they land in space. There are 3 ways of that bubble disappearing. Number 1, disappears after 2 minutes. Number 2, you can bomb it. So if you use a bomb or a smart bomb, anything with AoE damage, you can destroy the bubble. That's why, for example, Rorquals have...
Yep, something's tackled.
What is it?
Requiem comms, apparently.
Okay, let's see if...
Have them join the warp C2.
What's tackled? A Requiem...
Hold on, they're pinging for Eagles, Basilisk, and Harpies now.
Okay, let's we'll continue this in a minute, guys. Okay, so part 2, coming back after the rock save. So I was just talking about Hicks versus Dicks. Dictors, small fast, Hictors, big tanky. So Dictors are normally what we want for rock saves. They're really useful in fleet fights because you can get ahead of the fleet. Dictors are pretty much useful in everything, so Dictors are always a good ship to have. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is staying alive. Now, the mistake I see a lot of new addictive pilots make is they will... a fleet fight will be happening, and normally when a fleet fight happens, the first part of the fleet fight is the 2 fleets kind of positioning to move around each other before the fight actually happens. At this point, if the other fleet isn't running, you don't need to bubble them, because they're not running anywhere, so all you're going to do is put yourself in danger. Normally Dictors are a high priority target for FCs to call, because they could mean If you need to run away, you can't. Also, they're squishy. They're a quick, easy kill mail at 70 mil in your pocket. I will normally primary a dictor first thing on as we land on grid, just because it's an easy thing to get the ball rolling while you get set up. For that reason, you don't want to just warp or burn at the enemy and start bubbling them. You only want to bubble them if they disappear. So a question that was asked earlier is, do you want to be with the FC, taking the FC's warps, or do you want to be warping independently? Regardless of which of these you do, if you find yourself on grid with the enemy, the first thing you probably want to do is maybe just hit that cloak button. If you've come out of the fleet with out of warp with the rest of the fleet, you might want to just burn 10 kilometers down, just away from them, and cloak up. So what this does is actually really important. First off, it allows you to assess what's going on. You can get somewhere nice and safe and cloak up. You can then start watching what happens. The other thing it does, which is really, really important, is the first thing that happens when a fleet lands on grid is the enemy FC will look at the fleet comp and say, okay, here's what I've got. I've got so many Logi, so many Hugin, so many Dictors, and they'll kind of know what's up. If you cloak straight up immediately, you're not in there thinking of, oh, I'm a thing you need to worry about, because you're invisible. PL are really, really good at this. You never see a PL Dictor until you try and evacuate your fleet, and at the moment you do, 10 Dictors decloak and you just get bubble fucked. And the FC's never prepared for it. So you want to cloak up and just hide. After you've cloaked up and kind of assess the situation and see what happens, let's say the fight's starting now, the two guys are shooting each other. At that point you want to maybe decide, is there a better place I can be? So if you've just cloaked up on grid, you might not be within warp distance of the enemy, they might be too close. So normally what should happen in a fleet fight, is interceptors, like Dictors, if they're not actively tackling someone, they're burning tacticals around. So they're now burning outside, away, providing tacticals for warp outs. You can see a Dictor more than 150 away from you, break your cloak, warp to them, and then cloak up again. This gives you the advantage now of when you do decide you want to go in against the enemy, you can decloak and warp to a wreck or warp to a blue directly on top of the bad guys. So being further away is better than being close. So the other option you've got, one thing to do is stay on grid and wait until the enemy are about to run. And you can either judge that yourself based on kind of gut feel, or hopefully the FC will tell you. The FC will tell you these guys are about to run. Like, we've killed enough of their Logi, these guys are going to lose the fight, their FC is going to know that they're about to run and tell you to go in and bubble. If the FC doesn't do that, you can kind of make that call yourself. Obviously, if you make that call too late, they escape. If you make it too early, you die. So it's tricky. But being cloaked to begin with means that the enemy FC target caller isn't going to be looking at you. He's going to be he's going to have one Logi broadcasted, he's going to have the second Logi he's thinking about, he's going to broadcast. If a Sabre appears somewhere else on that overview tab, he's probably not going to spot it. And also, if it doesn't look good, you can of course just cloak up or warp off again and come back in at a more opportune time. The other option, rather than staying on the fleet, is knowing where they're going to run away to. So what I always like to do is I always like to have dotlan open. I like to know who I'm fighting, where they're likely going to be going, and what route they'll likely be taking. So ideally you're looking for choke points, like systems they have to jump through when they escape, and you can move to that direction. So the outgate of your current system is an obvious example. If you can warp to that at 100 from the grid and bubble up, if their FC is bad and warps directly to that gate at 0, they'll land in that bubble. More likely though, what they'll do is warp to a ping and warp to the gate, or have a scout it, so you can always be on the other side of that gate. Or you can maybe warp to that gate at 100, bubble up, burn 50 away, burn back to the gate, jump through and wait for them. The idea there is you always want the Dictors to be ahead of the enemy fleet. So when the enemy fleet's running, if we already have Dictors in front of them, bubbling their exits, bubbling gates ahead of them, it slows them down without slowing down the friendly fleet. Does that make sense, what I've just described there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Cool. Also, like I said previously, don't aggress. Don't aggress ever. If you aggress in a fleet fight, that means you can't jump gates, means you can't run away. That's a huge advantage you have as a Dictor that a DPS fleet doesn't, because you don't get aggression. Also keep in mind that no matter what the fleet is, really, you can normally activate cloak before they can lock you, particularly if they're not paying attention to you. If you're the only one close to them and the enemy fleet isn't shooting at the friendly fleet, you're going to be the only thing in their mind as a Dictor on them at 0. If they're busy, you've got some time to deal with things, so you can warp to them, or maybe warp to them at 10 and then cloak up. If you cloak up, they're going to immediately forget you or try and decloak you. If they don't get the decloak off, you can decloak and warp away in a few seconds. That enemy target caller is going to be very busy trying to do other things, so if you don't make yourself a target, your chance of being primaried goes down dramatically. Other than that, it's your classic PvP. You want to be moving fast, you want to have your hardeners on, you want to overheat your hardeners, you want to warp away as soon as you can. So ideally, as you're entering a grid to bubble, always have in mind, before you even land, what your exit's going to be, what direction you're going to burn in, what celestial you're going to warp to. So just kind of, you want to be in and out as quickly as possible so you don't get killed. If you stay on grid, you're very squishy, you'll get popped. Okay, so we talked a little bit about moving around gates. So this is the thing an FC might ask you to do in a fleet fight. They may say, okay, we're here, I think the enemy's going to run to there, so can I get a Dictors D up in fleet? And then they'll call you by name to go to a gate and bubble there. This happens in most fleets. Now, one thing that all FCs forget to do, which I am definitely guilty of, is tell you to come back, or tell you to stop doing that thing. If the enemy goes a different way, then at that point you need to make your own call as a Dictor. It's one of the reasons flying a Dictor is so fun. You get to make a lot of decisions yourself about the fight. You get to manually pilot your ship and make decisions about what's going on, unlike DPS, which is following primaries. So if you go to a gate and the enemy fleet hasn't gone to you, it looks like they've gone another direction, absolutely stop following the FC's orders and move to a position that will be more useful. Now, either the friendly FC, the fighting grid, or a different gate. That's absolutely fine to do. You don't need to fly with the fleet, you can fly by yourself. Like I said earlier, I kind of like to have 50-50, maybe half my Dictors with me, half my Dictors buzzing around. Now keep in mind though, as a Dictor, you're not as fast or agile as an Interceptor, so maybe don't get too far away from the fleet, particularly in hostile areas. What we don't want to do is all the Dictors die before we've even got to combat because they've been picked off by small roaming gangs. I've talked a little bit about offensive bubbles. So offensive bubbles are what you do to an enemy fleet to kind of stop them moving. The other type of bubble is a defensive bubble. So a defensive bubble is a bubble you normally put on your own fleet that will stop enemies attacking you. And there's two main cases when you use defensive bubbles. The first is bombers. So one defense against bombers, particularly if you have an anti-bomber wing in your fleet. So if you've got something with like instant application, very high tracking, like a cormorant wing or something like that with your fleet, or a lot of defender missiles, you may defensively bubble a fleet. So if your fleet isn't moving very fast, let's say your battleships, you're sat on a grid, you're stuck still, you're not moving a lot, or you've got capitals in play, for example, an FC may ask you to what's called bubble fuck a grid. So the idea of that is you fly all over the grid and basically cover the friendly ships in bubbles. The reason this works is it means that the enemy bomber FC now can't warp to you at optimal bombing range, bomb and warp out. They have to warp to you at maybe a weird angle, which is very difficult to do, or they'll warp to you and land in the bubbles and then have to turn around and go out again, or they'll do very dangerous things like land in the bubble, bomb, and then try and burn out, in which case all the subcaps kill them very quickly. So bubble fucking a grid basically just means bubble the entire friendly grid. Things to keep in mind here is you don't want to drop all three bubbles on top of each other. You want to kind of space them out so they cover the whole thing. Same thing for gates. If you're bubble fucking a gate, maybe drop the first bubble at 0 on the gate, but ideally after that all other bubbles you want to be maybe 10 kilometers off the gate. The idea being you cover the gate in a bigger sphere, which is good. The second type of a defensive bubble is kind of a screening bubble. So you'd normally do these if you're in a kiting fleet. So let's say we're in Cerberuses or we're in Harpies, for example, great kiting fleet. So what might happen in these situations is we're trying to stay at range from the enemy, and the enemy is going to want to get on top of us. Harpies, when you're doing the whole kiting business, are very fast, very agile. They're ducking and weaving, avoiding enemies, and popping things as they come in close. Now what an enemy is going to want to do is get over 150 away and warp in on us at 0, and that's not where we want them to be. So what you can do in that scenario is do a screening bubble, a defensive bubble. And in this case you almost always don't want to bubble the Harpies themselves, but you want to put a bubble between where the Harpies are, or ideally where the Harpies are about to be, and where the enemy fleet is. So if you imagine the Harpies are anchored up burning in one direction, and you've got the enemy fleet kind of next to us, defensive bubbles would be just on the edge of the Harpies, so they're not quite in the bubble, in the line that we're burning towards, and that stops the enemy or makes it a lot harder for the enemies to jump on top of us. Really, really useful when we're doing kitey fleets. It can be a super defense against them warping to you at 0 and you getting tackled. Quite difficult to do, but super, super valuable. The other thing I missed in the bubble mechanic talk a minute ago was You can boosh bubbles around. So one technique you would use in snatch fleets is maybe you have a dictor bubble up and then you'd boost the bubble onto enemies. The other thing you can do is if someone puts a bad bubble in a position, you can boost the bubble off its bad position into a good position or into a neutral position. So boosting of bubbles is a thing to keep in mind.
Can you explain how exactly you do
How
that?
you boost your bubble? Yeah, sure
Yes.
thing. So there's a class of ship called command destroyers. They can fit a module, only these ships can fit the module. It's called a micro jump field generator. The micro jump field generator, or MJF people call it, is incredibly powerful and incredibly difficult to use. So what it does is you activate your module and anything within 6 kilometers of you will get warped 100 kilometers, like instantly transmitted 100 kilometers in the direction that the command des is flying. So it takes about 6 seconds to activate. This works on friendly ships, hostile ships, bubbles. Doesn't work on capitals, and it doesn't work on anything that's scrammed. Interestingly enough, though, this works without breaking a tether, without breaking a lock. Sorry. So what you can do with a micro jump field is, if you've got a long-range scramming ship like a Hictor, you can have a Hictor and a Dictor kind of teamed up together. You can MJD the Hictor really close to the kiting ship, the enemy kiting ship, while it's pre-locked, and then you can immediately apply the scram. So you can do some really cool things with micro jump drives. Oh, micro jump field, sorry. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think I'll probably have to jump in one to actually do it to really
Yeah.
get it, but it's good to
Yeah,
hear.
they're really cool. If you can fly a Dictor, you're very close to being able to fly a command destroyer as well. They're awesome for links, and they're awesome for that MJF. So definitely consider getting into one of them. They are super fun. Very, very high skill cap on them.
Is there any recommended, like, is it typically we go with the shield fits?
Yeah, so
or-
Stalk or Bifrost, both are useful. Stalk gives more bonuses to info links. Bifrost gives more bonuses to skirmish links. We need both. So whichever your highest destroyer skill is, they're both great. I can link you some fits after if you'd like. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is getting yelled at by FCs. So Dictors are probably the most likely ship you'll fly for you to be yelled at by an FC. The reason for this is you can bubble your own fleet, which stops the FC from warping off to kill the enemy or warping off to run away from bombs. Probably the worst thing you can do is if the fleet is aligned somewhere to walk away from bombs. Enemy bombers decloak, the FC tries to warp the fleet away, and a bubble's up and it gets the whole fleet killed. That's probably like the worst case scenario. But pretty much any time you get the friendly fleet caught in your bubbles, it makes the FC sad. So what I would recommend doing is don't ever bubble the fleet. Never bubble on top of the DPS fleet unless the FC explicitly calls you to. Now, obviously there's cases when, like, that's obvious, but cases where it's maybe not so obvious is if you're warping like you probe down a bad guy and you probe directly into them, you warp to them at 0, it looks like they're on grid for a lot longer than they are. So what a lot of people do is you feel like you're out of warp, so you're like, great, they're there, hammer that probe button, but you're still in warp, so it doesn't work. And then the time it takes for you to exit warp and that thing you're spamming that probe button to try and get them, they warp off. Now what unfortunately that means is they've warped off on your bubble, so you now have to go from 0 velocity outside the bubbles and then warp. So keep that in mind as a potential case when you want to make sure you're bubbling correctly. What happened in a fleet today is someone tried to put a drag bubble or a catch bubble between the Lokis and a gate, which caught some friendly capitals. That got some people yelled. Bubbling capitals, never really a good idea. There is a slight chance you will get called primary when you're flying a Dictor if you bubble the wrong fleet, particularly if you're doing things in a way that makes you look like a spy. That is definitely a thing that happens, so keep that in mind, and just be cautious of the probe button. Probably the final thing, which is a lot harder but happens, is if we're trying to chase a fleet and you put up your stop bubble behind that fleet instead of in front of them, that helps them and doesn't hurts us. So you want to make sure if you drop a bubble on a gate that, let's say the enemy are in a system and they're leaving the system and you're on their out gate. It's only worthwhile dropping that bubble before they enter warp. So if you know they're not in warp, drop that bubble, they'll get caught in it, that's awesome. Mistake would be though, if they're already in warp, you drop the bubble there, they don't get stuck in it, but then our fleet chasing does, so you really need to make sure you are in fact ahead of them. In that situation, the best thing to do is, rather than bubble the side of the gate they're on, jump through the gate, bubble the other side, because that way you're guaranteed to get them. And in fact, if you've got 3 bubbles in your tubes, you can jump through ahead of them, kind of do a few bubbles, reload and jump back through. So there's some of the kind of the more common places where I see dictors mess up. Don't be afraid though, it doesn't happen that often. Just be aware of what you're doing and the impact you can have on the fleet, and you'll be fine. Last thing I want to talk about again, or more remind people, is Cynodictors. Super useful, particularly for Rork saves. The more Cynos we have on grid and the more ability we have to stop bad guys, the better it'll be for getting dank kills. So please consider, if you've got an alt or a main who can fly one, to get into them. Okay, that is all of my pre-prepared things I wanted to talk about. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
So essentially, I should fit a Cyno as well on my Interdictor.
So it depends on the situation. For just being around immensely in Rork saves, the Cynodictor's awesome. Cynodictor's probably the one you want. For main fleets, you probably want something with a bit more tank. And for small gang roaming, you might want to scram and some guns on there just for a little bit extra DPS.
So one thing that you want to make sure of is if the enemy fleet is running away, you always want to be in front of the enemy fleet if you're bubbling.
Exactly. You need to kind of predict where they're going to be going to, which is easier than sometimes in others. Get ahead of them and bubble up and keep ahead of them. So even after we've kind of grabbed them once, normally if you bubble up, Harpies will jump in, grab them once, grab a few of them, but a lot of them will escape, and we can just do this multiple times. Good Dictor pilots just mean so many more kills.
So basically, if you say they were, like they were in earlier, they were in D TAC Y or DY TAC, you jump into HR TAC if that's the direction they're heading, burn off of the gate 10 kilometers, bubble it, and then kind of warp off and get out of the bubble and get away from there so you can warp to the next area they might be going.
Exactly right. So predict where they're going to go, bubble ahead of them. I think, in fact, Shattered did that. I think we got a single Munin kill on that fleet, and I think it was when Shattered moved his Cyno alt, his Cynodictor, through and caught them as they were escaping. What would have been the wrong thing to do is when we jumped in with the Eagles, at that point, don't bubble anything, because they're off us, they may be trying to run, but if you just burnt at them, you would have immediately popped.
Oh, okay.
Can you link that fit again? I don't see it in the
yeah, sure thing. Which one? The Cyno one?
Yes.
Yeah, 1 second.
Now, what would you do if you have them in a pocket system? How far, if they're coming to the gate, how far off do you want to actually bubble the gate?
It really depends. I mean, a good FC won't get caught in a stop bubble. A bad FC will, but a good FC won't. So probably hedge your bets. Maybe drop one at like 30 off the gate, because that's cool. At 30 off is enough distance where it's a long way for them to burn in. But don't go too far off, because if they go via a ping, they'll get through the gate anyway. Ideally, you're best putting a bubble on the gate at 0. That way they have to get a little bit of bubble, but then further off, maybe drop one. If you walk to the gate at 0, drop a bubble there, burn back the direction that you came, maybe 30, 40 kilometers, drop a second one. That covers both bases. I don't know if you guys were in the Rork save earlier when we killed all the Lokis, but the way we killed those Lokis was we had a bubble on their outgate, and they walked to the gate at 0. So they got caught on the edge of that bubble, and then made the foolish decision of turning around and running away, which allowed us to just get Harpies all over them. So if we hadn't had that bubble there, they would have jumped through that gate and escaped through that wormhole.
Oh, okay.
That, whatever it was, 13 bill of Loki kills we got earlier, that was all because of one Dictor was in the right place at the right time. Like, we would have got 0 kills if it wasn't for them.
Why would you choose to place a drag bubble instead of a stop bubble, or what circumstances would be best for that?
Good question. So a drag bubble is a bubble behind a gate that drags you from where you would land to the bubble. A stop bubble is a bubble that's in front of the gate, so you stop at the bubble rather than at your gate. Basically, they're completely interchangeable. It doesn't really matter. Drag bubbles are a little more disorientating. Normally you'd use drag bubbles for anchored bubbles rather than for dictors. stop bubbles or catch bubbles are easier to do because you land at the gate at 0 and realign back to where you were and just burn, and you're guaranteed to be in line. Catch bubbles behind, drag bubbles behind, especially if you burn a long way, you can get the angle slightly wrong and they don't catch them.
Can you drop bubbles and
You cannot drop bubbles in warp.
Okay.
This might be specific, but in a small gang, when do I know when's the right time to aggress?
Yeah, good question. Really hard to say. Normally, with a dictor, you'll probably be the initial tackle, so you'll probably tackle the dudes as you come through a gate, for example, with your bubble. If there are other people on field who can get scrams, I would probably hold off a little bit. I'd probably just hold off just to see if anything else comes through the gate, or if it looks like we're going to lose that fight. The moment it's looking good, maybe you've got all the guys on grid that you're going to get, or it looks like you're going to win. At that point, start piling on the deeps. The risk is if you aggress too soon, you then can't jump the gate. If you've already got guys fully engaged at 0 on them, join your friends and die with honour.
Alright.
Dictor's not actually a fast tackle because the cloak hurts your scan resolution just by having
yeah. Some of these fits I linked earlier have scrams. Very niche use case for the scram. Pretty much it's like a secondary scram in a small gang situation. In a big fleet fight or a Rorke save, you're basically never using the scram. The only time I think you'd ever really use a scram would be if you maybe manage to catch a basilisk off a gate or something that isn't going to shoot you and you can hold it down. But yeah, very good point. The scram is not the point of the dictor. That's not how you earn your value.
What's my biggest bane?
Your biggest bane is how high an enemy FC will call you as a target. So you will probably be the first thing to get called primary. Particularly if you're in front of the main fleet or being overly aggressive, you will get primaried first. I mentioned earlier some of the things you can do to kind of mitigate that.
Be on 0 at the gate or at attack?
Someone asked a question in fleet. What constitutes a stop bubble? Meaning, can you bubble between 2 gates, and if the fleet warps from one gate to the other, will they be stopped in the bubble? Yes, absolutely. Yes. Okay, so I didn't actually talk about this mechanic. Incredibly important bubble mechanic. It goes for all types of bubbles. So let's say you warp from point A to point B. Directly in line, either in front of, actually between those 2 points, or directly behind of point B, is a bubble. And very importantly, that bubble has to be up when you enter warp, not when you exit warp. It's actually when you right-click warp to. When your game says ship warp drive activated, it's that point. The bubble has to be up before then. If that happens, and that bubble is within, is it 5,000 kilometers now? 500 kilometers. If it's within 500 kilometers of where you will exit warp, your ship will stop. So that's what a catch bubble or a drag bubble. Super useful for catching people off gates. A lot of gate camps will use this situation. Interestingly though, bubble mechanics don't work the other way around. So let's say I'm warping from point A to point B, and there's a bubble directly in line with point B from where I am in point A, and it's on my grid, as in it's by point A. You can warp straight through that. You can warp straight through the bubble. It's only when you're exiting warp the catch bubbles take effect. Cool. Any more questions?
It has to be at an angle though. If it's directly in front of you, it won't. You will get a message that says there's a bubble in your way.
No, you only get that message if the place you're warping to is also on grid. So if I'm warping from point A to point B, and point A and point B are both on grid, and there's a bubble in between, you will get that message. If point B is on a different grid, you can warp through that bubble.
How big is grid?
Big. It's within 500 kilometers, I guess. I don't know how big a grid is these days, but fucking big. On grid, yeah, good point. So on grid means when you can see people in your overview, they are on the same grid with you. Back in the dawn of time, grids used to be a lot smaller, maybe 200 or 300 kilometers in radius. Now grids are really big. They're thousands of, you can be, 2 gates can be 10,000 kilometers away from each other, and you can kind of see ships on them. Big grids means the concept of grid is less important, but things in EVE can only affect you if they're on the same grid as you. If you can see them on your overview, they're within grid, on the same grid.
Okay, so in some gates, even though a gate might be 5,000 kilometers off and you don't see it, on the ones that are 10,000, you'll be considered on the same grid if you are, and you cannot warp through the bubble, even though it's 10,000 off.
Yes, I believe that is correct, if I understood that correctly. Grids, there used to be a thing, I think one of the goons wrote, it was a white paper called Grid Foo, and it was all the ridiculous things you can do to manipulate grid boundaries to just like fuck things up. If you're interested in nerdy EVE things, it's a really cool mechanic to learn. It's not particularly useful anymore with the big grids. Yes, dropping a bubble midway between two gates doesn't do anything. It has to be within 500 kilometers of where they exit warp and directly in line, either in front of or behind them. Awesome. Guys, thank you so much for coming out. Sorry, one question there. How will kill mails work? Kill mails work if something dies that attempted to warp out of your bubble and wasn't able to because the bubble was there. So if they're in the bubble and they try and warp out and they can't, and then they die within 15 minutes, you get on the kill mail. You don't get on the kill mail if they die in the bubble and they didn't attempt to warp out. So you don't get a lot of kill mails in a dictor. That's the downside of a dictor. But you do get a lot of glory.
I got a silly question. What if you're not fully trained up to use one of these the saves? Because I got like 14 days before I can use the actual probe launcher that launches the bubbles. So what?
Yeah, annoyingly, you need a bunch of ridiculous prerequisites to fly the probe launcher. You need to train a bunch of science skills. It's really stupid. Yeah, it is quite a long train, unfortunately. It isn't worth flying a dictor until you can fly the probe launcher, but consider flying a command destroyer because they're very similar skills and also really useful in most of our fleets. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you again for coming back after the rock save in the middle there. If you have any questions, please PM me in game or on Discord or on Slack. Thank you so much.